Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to everyone at ESPAS and all involved in organizing this conference. Unfortunately, because of votes, I couldn't attend the morning part, but I heard it was really excellent. So I'm very glad that we're bringing such cutting-edge thinking into the European Parliament to inspire and to connect people. I think it is key. And the theme of this session, international rules in a world where might is right, is something that really fascinates me as well. We need to only look at the headlines of news every day to see that zero-sum approach to the world is back, that there is a big battle between protectionist forces and those who believe in more openness, that of course the new president of the United States has a very different relationship to multilateralism than what we might hope or what we had known the US to be like. And every day, I think we see more and more confrontations, sometimes very bloody ones, when it comes to lack of respect for international law. Think about the illegal annexation of Crimea, the gross violations of human rights in Syria through the bombardments of civilian centers, including hospitals. Confrontations between also the European Union and other global players when it comes to not only might, but also the sets of rules and norms that may be mainstream, that may be expected, and that we measure each other against. At the same time, and I think that this is a fascinating paradox, maybe we'll get to with the panelists as well, there's high expectations about what the EU can do and should do. I serve on the Trade Committee, and if I look at the push by civil society in Europe, but also by many of my colleagues, to include more and more normative aspects into trade law, trade rules, anything from human rights to environmental protection to higher labor standards, it is very clear that there is still a great ambition and also expectation that we can increase the respect for human rights as the EU and push for that agenda in today's world. And I guess one of my questions would be to the panelists, but we can get to that also after your remarks, is whether that is realistic. Is this high ambition by the EU the best way to go, or does it also cause for bigger confrontations and a more difficult situation in terms of getting consensus or a broad coalition around this? Another area where we see developments in Europe is the new policy areas, especially around technology. I think the EU is clearly a normative rule maker, both in the digital single market with the general data protection regulation, the net neutrality being enshrined in EU law, but also strong competition rules that should guide not only the offline economy, but also the online economy. And in a space where there's relatively few laws and rules, I think it could be interesting to look at what the EU can achieve with its leadership, because rarely ever do we have an opportunity to shape rules on a white sheet, so to say. So on a situation where it's not already completely locked in and where we can only amend with small margins of impact. Now, lastly, one of the things that I think we need to look at and admit the challenges about is the general eroding consensus around the importance of the rule of law and human rights in Europe. I think Heather will say a few words about that as well, the deep concerns that we have about the direction that countries like Poland and Hungary are taking, but also the impact that it has on our credibility. I was leading the EU election observation mission to Kenya, and whenever I said something that people didn't really want to hear, they said, why don't you solve the problem in Catalonia first before you come and tell us how to run a democratic process? Or in Turkey, when I would like to address press freedom, I'm often referred to state of emergency in France or the destruction of hard drives in the UK. So what we do has a direct impact on our ability to lead globally. So this is just a few thoughts from my side, and I promise I won't say much else because we have such an excellent panel that I'm sure I will only have to cut you off instead of add more to it. Unfortunately, Lotte Leicht from Human Rights Watch had to apologize at the last minute. She had been announced to be here, but she apologizes because of some last-minute things that came up. So I'm very happy to introduce to you the panelists, also in the order in which they will speak. First of all, we will hear from Professor Simon Serfaty. It's a pleasure to meet you and to introduce you. He is the Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy at CSIS. He has written extensively about geopolitical developments, long-term scenarios, and I believe he will focus on the rise of China, the strategic implications in a multipolar world, and the strength of norms, or perhaps the competition for which norms that we are seeing today. Then we'll hear from Ambassador Christian Strohal. He is the special representative of the OSCE chair, and he will focus on the role of international organizations like the OSCE as well as the UN, and will reflect on what changes we may see until 2030, because that, of course, is the sort of line in the sand that we have drawn for today's events. And last but not least, Heather Grabbe. She is the head of the Open Society Institute Policy, Institute.
Policy Institute.
Yeah, both Institute.
No, Open Society European Policy Institute.
Institute, okay, sorry. I added one I in the middle. And she has worked in the European Commission as well, has researched trends of populism in the European Union, and will speak about the importance of human rights in Europe and the impact on global leadership. So we can now start with the introductions. May I give you the floor first?
Thank you. We're expected to jump to the year 2030 in 5 to 6 minutes, so I'll have to sketch an argument in some fashion. We're not speaking of the making of a new geopolitical order. We're speaking, of course, of the coming of a new geopolitical order. And there has to be more than understanding China about this idea of where we might be by the year 2030. Past the Trump moment, the United States still remains and will remain not only a preeminent but also a preponderant state. Past Brexit, the EU recast into a union, Europe recast into a union, will have to reach some moment of adulthood and assert a role in the world which is compatible with its interests and its capabilities. And Russia is also part of this conversation as a state that escaped the Soviet hijacking, which took place in 1917, and is returning to its old imperial ways in whatever form it can. Now, these three states or quasi-states, together with China, will indeed form a geostrategic quartet, a pas de quatre, if you will, for the year 2030. Each one of them has a blend of strength and weaknesses, the lack of which still has to be worked out. China, for example, it will not be that easy and that clear and that one-sided as it keeps moving on. It needs 30 years of good economic performance and improved, frankly, governance. The EU quite clearly has to move forward toward its finality, not only as a power in the world, but as a world power, which demands additional capabilities and will to assert itself in all of its dimensions. The United States, past Trump, needs to work out the way in which it wants to manipulate its excessive power, to share it, to use it, or to save it by going back home. And Russia will have to manage its basic weaknesses, a shortage of people, a shortage of security space, a shortage of capabilities, and therefore a shortage of time. So there's still a way to go as we move toward the new geopolitical order of 2030. Still, we can point to the idea that if you add to these four dominant states, quasi-states in 2030, the multitude of players, including Japan, but also Brazil, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, all kinds of bits of power, if you will, regionally determining, but globally influential. Then you come up with 3 guidelines for engagement on our way to the blessed year of 2030. One, no state alone, however peerless, will be able to do without allies. And that is true of institutions as well. No institution, however organized and cohesive, will be able to do without partners. Partners, allies that are not only capable, but also willing and relevant and eventually compatible. To a second guideline will be that no form of power alone, military or otherwise, value-based, however you want to define it, will be sufficient. Either you will be a complete power and have a combination of it all, or will not be a main player. The world ahead is based on the BYO principle. You bring your own, and if you cannot bring your own at the table, you don't get a seat, and that does include military power, for example. And the third guideline for engagement in this up-and-coming world is indeed that no issue alone is going to define it. No issue alone. It's not just about X, Y, or Z. It's about all of the above, as we have learned over the past 20 years. So it's a kind of multipolarity that is unfolding, but it is full multipolarity still, because there is no balance. There is no fixed alliance. There is no predictable order in what is. All we know is in the negative tense. We know that the unipolar moment is over, never to be resurrected, because no one else can assume that position. We know that bipolarity is not going to come back. Forget about notions of a new Cold War and all that. This is just academic imagination. The fact of the matter is that this is over the world structure as we knew it between 1945 and 1991. What we have instead is indeed the making of new alignments, because each major power is looking for a choreography in this kind of pas de quatre that we see emerging. And what can we already say about it? 2 more minutes. That the gap between Russia and China will continue to expand. And that's the gap, the security gap, the capabilities gap between Russia and China continues to expand. Not only will there be no prospect of a G2 between Russia and China, because China is not particularly interested in Russia, and Russia is more interested in the West than it is, frankly, in China in terms of the need to fulfill its potential. There will be a potential there for Russia moving to the West, as it usually and historically done, notwithstanding its domineering and imperial attitude, again, historically based. So we have to show some kind of patience with Russia, and maybe we'll come back to that. Second, if indeed there is no likelihood of a new Chinese relationship with either the United States and Europe, forget about the G2 between the United States and China. It's just not going to happen. There's not enough compatibility. Then we are left with China looking for new allies in Asia, because China is obviously the dominant power in Asia, but it is not the partner of choice on the part of so many of the states on the continent. And we see South Korea, for example, developing a Plan B and so forth in terms of its relationship with China. What we're left in terms of the potential axis of stability for the new geopolitical order of 2030 is, as it has always been in the sense of the past 60 years, the special relationship between the United States and the EU, not in and of itself, together with others, but still the most compatible linkage that can be done between those two states. One last sentence. Will we get there? We will find order when we get there. The US with the EU plus a few others, China, Russia moving westward, China asserting its indeed new dominance in a sense within at least its region. Well, frankly, it's too early to tell. It's too early to tell. It will depend on the manner, the extent to which the upcoming geopolitical shocks are managed over the next several years. And we're not speaking of specific issues in those geopolitical orders, shocks. It is not just about Iran. It is about the totality of the greater Middle East, which is unraveling at a rapid pace. It is not just about North Korea. It is about the stability of Northeast Asia and the reshuffling of alliances that is emerging. And finally, it is not about Ukraine and Russia. It is about the totality of Europe East, which has to be engaged to the extent it is yet a member of either the EU or NATO. So it's a moment of fluidity. It's more reminiscent, frankly, of the 1920s than of the 1950s, but hopefully we will do with the 1920s a better job in the 2020s than we did 100 years ago, I think.
Thank you so much. I don't envy you, but you've really sketched such a complexity, many outstanding questions, but certainly a dramatic change from the world that we knew. So thank you very much. Ambassador, may I give you the floor now?
Maybe I take my cue from 3 points you made, which is the confrontations are up and the expectations are up, and maybe the credibility is in question, and add from Professor Serfaty the engagement point, and start with a somewhat banal question: why do we have to discuss rules at all? I mean, this should be a given. And I think there are three sort of interlinked reasons why we do have to discuss rules. One is that rules, of course, are violated, have been violated, and will continue to be violated. This doesn't mean that the rules are bad. It probably means that we are bad. And the second point then would be accountability for implementing or non-implementing is more interesting. And accountability is weak. And accountability is also weakened. Both of these points are not new and have been with us for a while, and we have been, I think, developing mechanisms to look at both implementation and accountability and sanctions, if possible, for non-implementation. What maybe is more new is the systematic questioning of rules as such. Do we have the right rules? Are they universal? And are they the right sort of rules? And I think maybe I can quickly sort of look at these three issues. Violations, I think there is a key point there is how can we prevent them from becoming systematic and develop respective mechanisms. On accountability, as I've said, there is progress, both positively and negatively. In the more sort of, let's say, negative approach, there is naming and shaming, which has been with us for a long time, but which presupposes that people are getting ashamed. And if you don't, then naming and shaming is pretty useless. So other answers have to be developed: judicial, political, practical, We do have international criminal work now. It took 22 years for Ratko Mladic, but we got there yesterday. And both in political and in practical terms, I think the time frames are faster. On the questioning of the rules as such, maybe one key moment from my perspective was in the year when Russia invaded its neighbor, the annual Valdai Club discussion in Sochi, which is Russia's answer to Davos. The motto of that year's session was written in much bigger letters than here on the wall behind Mr. Putin and his friends. And the motto was world order, semicolon, new rules or no rules, question mark. I guess the question mark may have been more rhetoric than sort of
exclamation mark.
Yes, and 3 years later, I would argue it certainly may have turned more into an exclamation mark than in a kind of still open question. So to that effect, that the annual report of the Munich Security Conference this year, as its title had post-truth, post-West, post-order, question mark again. I asked Ambassador Ischinger yesterday, how about your question mark? Well, he said, well, that is getting smaller by the day. Winter is coming. This is what he told us yesterday. So we have this sort of, this starting point that the rules are fundamentally questioned. Do we need new rules? We may need certainly new rules for new areas which are unregulated, but I don't think we need new rules because the old rules are being questioned or people don't like them. Maybe there is more need to strengthen those rules, to make them more systematic, to make their implementation more stringent, and to make accountability more important. For all of that, my argument would be we need an effective multilateralism, which also is questioned like never before, or certainly like not in a long time. So there is a danger for a circulus viciosus into the wrong direction, but this is not an automatic danger. And the answer, of course, is sort of picking up what Dimitri Trenin told us yesterday. The EU is not a strategic player, but maybe it should become one. So for the Union to step into that role of defending those rules, of strengthening the rules, and of working against those who questions the rules as such, I think the recipes have not changed. They are pretty simple. We had when at the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, there was an effort with external experts, which resulted in a publication called Leading by Example, a human rights agenda for the Union in the year 2000. I think if you reread that, you will realize that we have come a long way, positively. But this leading by example certainly has become more complicated, as has been mentioned. Credibility is down. So, of course, the job starts at home, but the job also starts in engaging. And I think my sort of points would be, first of all, talk. We need more dialogue, particularly with those with whom we disagree. But we also need to walk the talk. And to engage with concrete action plans and concrete action. We are very good in talking, arguably better than in following through with action. Thirdly, we have to be accountable ourselves. We have to embrace accountability even where it is hurting or not particularly comfortable. Fourthly, I think we need to look towards the future. Where are the new threats and challenges? We've been hearing about them ever since yesterday morning. But there are also new opportunities, and these are areas where it may also be easier to engage with others. And we have to use and develop the existing networks, in particular multilateral organizations and institutions, but maybe in a way which goes beyond the classical state-to-state approach, which is necessary but increasingly insufficient. Again, something which we have been hearing since yesterday. And that would mean developing much more sort of in a systematic manner a multi-stakeholder approach, bringing in business, bringing in civil society, engaging with civil society in a manner which does not make them more threatening in the eyes of those who are weak and feel threatened by them, but in order to sort of strengthening and supporting them. And also engaging with non-state actors in other areas. And I think for all of this, this is probably my little PR element at the end. The OSCE is an interesting framework. We have 57 people sitting around the table in a consensus mode, which can be extremely irritating and cumbersome. But if there is a consensus, then it works, even in times of severe crises like the crisis which we euphemistically call in and around Ukraine. We were able to decide together, all 57, on an important monitoring mission to Ukraine, which is doing invaluable work on the ground since more than 3 years, with about more than 1,000 people on the ground under increasingly difficult circumstances. But at the same time, we were also able to agree, again, at 57, just another example, on confidence building measures vis-a-vis cyber threats, on cyber security. Again, a way showing that there are islands of cooperation which are important enough for all 57 to work even in times of severe crisis and stress. So we have the tools of a forum. The Permanent Council in Vienna is the only place in the world where there is a weekly meeting, bilateral, between the Russian and the American representative, not because it's so productive or because they like each other, but because it has always been like that. So as a forum, both multi and bilaterally, it is important. It is operational. I mentioned the example of the Ukraine. There are other field missions. And it is also, has the institutional framework, also the independent institutions who bolster that, and where rules can be developed and can also be followed up on, and where accountability for the rules can be put on the table. So the conclusion for that would be for the Union to engage in a much more systematic and strategic way, as it is doing already, in this organization and with this organization, with the 56, or at least those who are not member states.
Thank you, Ambassador.
In that organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Heather, many important points to pick up on in terms of how the EU may be a stronger actor in these multilateral organizations, the impact of dialogue, if at all, the leading by example, whether on the basis of rules or order. Please.
So I'm going to talk about the underpinnings of EU action abroad in these rules. Christian has just been setting out the many ways in which rules are being questioned. I was asked to speak about human rights, and this is an area that is where the rules are not just questioned, they're being contested, actively, openly contested in the EU by some of the member states. And the domestic politics of rights affect greatly what the EU can and will do abroad. It's in this strange kind of EU vocabulary around rights. Outside the EU, they're human rights, and inside the EU, they're fundamental rights, which is a strange dichotomy, because they should really be the same set of rights. But they're often spoken of in quite different ways, and that's because of the way that rights are becoming increasingly contested in domestic politics. And I would start off by saying that it's going to be very hard for the EU to maintain its promotion of rights abroad if it doesn't maintain support for essentially the same rights at home. So how dear do Europeans really hold rights, and which ones do they care about? This morning, Florence Gaub was pointing out that Europeans put pressure on their politicians to intervene and get involved in conflicts because they're horrified by seeing violations, egregious violations of rights on their Twitter feeds and indeed on their Facebook feeds. She was arguing connectivity creates public pressure. But is it actually only the most egregious violations of rights? And she cited, for example, the use of chemical warfare by the Syrian government on its own citizens. Or are the rights that European citizens typically take for granted, are they still taken for granted? Are they still valued? It's interesting to see how in domestic politics, there are a lot of politicians now who portray rights as protecting only the terrorist suspect or the asylum seeker at the expense of the average citizen who, it seems, doesn't need these rights anymore. Instead, the average citizen needs public safety, needs economic welfare, needs the ethnic identity of the majority to be reaffirmed. And so the scapegoating of refugees, of immigrant communities, of minorities, actually detracts from the whole debate about rights as being something that apply to everybody, rights as being something that's important for the majority and the mainstream. Well, the evidence from polling, which is just one way of looking at it, but the evidence from polling is actually rather interesting on this. According to the latest Eurobarometer on this, EU citizens consistently identify peace, human rights, and democracy as the values that best represent the EU. Okay, so that's what they associate with the EU, but how much do they think those values actually matter to them in their daily lives? There was a very interesting YouGov study by Peter Kellner, which showed that of the rights that people were given in the survey, which were most important for them, more than 50% selected free speech as the most important. And the second one to come in, it didn't have a majority, but the second most important was the right to vote. But interestingly, when people were asked about how important is it to you to live in an area that has few immigrants, only 17% agreed with that statement, which tells you something about the attitudes towards multiculturalism and so on, which are so much contested. So one question is, which are the rights which are valued and which are still Europeans would want to protect, and therefore, which should be promoted abroad? Another one is who decides who gets which rights. And here we see two very different narratives coming up in terms of the contestation of rights. I won't mention member states here because I think you all know very well where these narratives are coming from, but also because where they're going to is spreading rather rapidly. It's interesting how the same arguments that arose in one member state start to appear in others. So one, which comes from the member state I know best, is the idea that unelected foreign judges, unelected judges in general, but especially unelected foreign judges, should not decide who gets which rights. And this is an argument which doesn't usually contest the rights themselves, but it contests who decides about rights, whether rights are being respected and who should actually get them. So that's a challenge both to the whole concept of international justice, and it's also, of course, a contestation of the arbiters of rights, but it's not actually a contest necessarily of the rights themselves. But there's a different narrative which is circulating and moving from one member state to another, which is really contesting the universality of rights through a kind of exception culturelle argument, which is that we, the native people of this country, as patriots, as Christians, as Catholics, we have a particular kind of culture which does not allow for multiculturalism and the assignment of rights to everybody. It means that our citizens need more protections than others, and it means that there shouldn't necessarily be equal application of rights to everyone, and that rights are essentially given through citizenship, and therefore the national government is the gatekeeper of who gets rights and how those rights are implemented and enforced. So that's a challenge both to the universality of rights and also to who applies them. And that's part of obviously another debate, which is about the role of nationalism in European politics. But it's also an important way in which the migration crisis and the increasing centrality of migration policy in other debates are driving attitudes towards, for example, rights, but also driving foreign policy itself. So finally, where will this contestation of rights as part of European values go? Where does it end up? It's still unclear whether the crisis over the rule of law that's happening in the European Union right now will lead to an increase in an EU agenda around values, and including rights, or whether it will actually lead to a destruction, a degradation of the consensus around them. Given the arguments about the need to enforce the will of the people, the need to protect the nation, and the argument that those values are more important than the universalist values that the EU was founded on and which were reinforced through the EU's treaties, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and so on. I think a very interesting question about this is whether there could be a feedback loop from the external promotion of human rights into the EU itself and its own fundamental rights agenda, because the EU has a much more elaborated agenda of what constitutes rights and values in its export model than it has consensus about those internally. It's still very much an open question, but I would argue that if politicians fail to make the political case proactively to show the relevance of rights for all citizens, including majorities, including the mainstream, that consensus could in fact break down, and that really would be a sad turn for the EU, and it would seriously affect the EU's capacity to play a normative role globally.
Thank you so much, Heather. It is now time for questions. We have only about 20 minutes left, so what I would suggest is we collect a couple of questions and then give the panel an opportunity to respond to what they think speaks to their expertise or thoughts. So who would like to start? Or is everyone a bit overwhelmed by what we just heard? Don't be shy. Yeah, Koert.
I have a question about Russia and China. I mean, yesterday Dmitry Trenin said that what Russia would love to do is having a coalition with China, I mean, well, against the rest, and because China is obviously more powerful than Russia. What you are saying is that the love is not the other way around. I mean, have I understood this correctly? And if yes, I mean, how is Russia going to try to do something about that?
Yes, gentleman over there.
Adrian Taylor. It strikes me the problem with international law is enforcement. And it is clear that some countries you can enforce the law with easier than you can with others. But if we look at the European experience, with enlargement especially, it was not the extension of rule of law by threat, it was by opportunity. That every country that was coming to the European Union soon they could actually gain something from doing this. Now, if we apply that one level higher in the globe, what are the opportunities we can be offering to others to be part of that global system and respect the law? And maybe just an idea, which is actually not my idea, it's an idea of a friend, Banning Garrett, from the US. He says that the US has every year a national threats assessment. There's no national opportunity assessment. Why not in the European Parliament have every year a European opportunity assessment where we look at what the opportunities are, which maybe technology now gives us, for instance, that people can report on what's going on in their country and the problems they're facing. Why not look at the opportunities for once? That's my positive plea.
Thank you for that. It also strikes me, just as we look around for another question, that sometimes there may be a large difference between, engaging on a government-to-government level or engaging with people. And it also touches on what Heather said, what polling reflects, expectations of standing for universality of human rights. Globally, often a huge difference between where populations may crave better respect for their rights and where governments fail to grant those rights. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. Do you see any relationship between the increasing secular worldview and the contestation of the universality of rights? And if so, what kind of relationship? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe add one last question. Yes.
Thomas Arnold, DG Research Innovation. With some of the evolutions on the environmental side, on the climate side, Will this also result in an update or revision of international law of human rights? Is there something like a right to clean air? What does this mean in many of those things in a trans-border context? Are there any issues that you see challenging? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think those were the questions. What I would suggest, if that's okay with you, is that we do final comments in the reverse order. So the Heather starts, then the ambassador, then professor. And then I think we'll conclude at around 2:20. So everyone has about 5 minutes for reflections and answers.
Okay, so I'm going to leave Kurt's very difficult question to Simon because that's more properly his area, but it's a very interesting question. Just to come back to the issues of law and rights and rules and so on, let's not forget the Trump effect in all of this. Tom Carruthers at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington wrote a fascinating paper I would really recommend to all of you about the impact of Trump on America's ability to promote rights and indeed values globally. And he refers to in it the way that Trump has given authoritarian relief syndrome, that essentially any dictator can say, well, America's given up on values, why should I have to enforce human rights? America's not obeying international courts and involving itself in international arbitration, so why should I have to do that? And so it's the kind of the absence of American pressure, he argues, which is one of the reasons why rights are more contested at home in other countries. So he does see the vacuum, the Trump vacuum, as having an impact. The question is, can the Europeans fill that vacuum? That's I think a very big question. But we're in a very different situation with enlargement, when other countries were voluntarily adopting EU models, including rule of law, because that was part of being a modern country. We now have we have different new definitions of what it means to be a modern country, which are much more based on sovereignty and the idea of the nation in circulation now. So this is all part of what Alex Stubb was talking about, the post 89 consensus changing and so on. I'm not convinced that it's about the increasingly secular worldview. Look at how active, for example, Pope Francis has been on rights when he talks about the integrity of the human being, for example. Rights are something which are very much there in a lot of discussions around by religious leaders as well. No, I think this is actually about power. This is about governments, particularly national governments, feeling more hemmed in, more constrained by the international obligations that there often many previous governments signed up to, which are constraining their room for maneuver, their power of action, on areas where they feel enormous pressure or indeed desire to act, particularly on the right to asylum. I mean, that's one of the most contested rights at the moment. The Geneva Convention is no longer popular with many politicians in Europe at all. Very few stand up and defend the Geneva Convention or just the right to asylum as a principle, let alone the application of it. And governments are defining it more and more narrowly. So it is those specific rights which are being contested because they affect the powers of national governments, but also the contestation of having international tying hands of various kinds, including EU membership. That is what's being contested too. This is the reassertion of national sovereignty for the benefit of particular parties which want to use their power at national level themselves. So, and it's also about room for policy maneuver in times of great stress. We've had since 2008 a series of crises, and in crises, governments, prime ministers never want to be told, you can't do that, Prime Minister, it'll abrogate all these international treaties we've signed. They just don't want to hear that argument. So instead of international treaties, international justice, international rules being seen as enabling factors, which is the narrative that we had more or less from, the Treaty of Rome up until till the kind of end of globalization, as it were, until about 2008, the idea that international rules allow, for example, a small but a very internationally connected economy like the Netherlands, they allow the Netherlands to play on an equal footing with China because everybody's obeying the rules. Instead, governments, faced by what they see as crises for their economies and indeed crises around migration, they want to be less constrained. So the trade-off, the balance between do international rules and including the norms of rights, do they constrain me or do they enable me? That balance has shifted in the eyes of politicians. So that's why, to come to the last question about new rights, it's harder harder to make the case for things like clean air and indeed things like the right to water, which is enshrined in the South African constitution. That was a major new development. That they are becoming much harder to put forward as rights, because rights are a form of rule, essentially. And governments just don't want to hear about rules that they haven't invented anymore.
Thank you.
Following on Heather, I think maybe starting with universality, that the contestation of universality is nothing new either. I mean, universality came as a result of World War II, and it has been contested on and off ever since. So it was a continuous and conscientious effort to defend universality against despots, against China, against the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. And so when that became interesting was maybe with the World Conference on Human Rights in '93, after the end of the Cold War, when there was a very sustained effort by China to use that opportunity to put an end to universality and say there are all these regional and historical and religious particularities which have to be taken into account. And that didn't work either. So I don't think that universality is sort of in danger. What is in danger is the implementation. With regard to opportunities and new rights, I think an opportunity assessment report sounds like a very great idea if that can be sustained. It certainly would also include maybe something which we are also not good enough, which is success stories. We are good in criticizing what has been going wrong, particularly if it's elsewhere, but we are not systematic in a similar manner on collecting best practice, on collecting success stories, on demonstrating what has been working and why, and how that could be of help to similar situations elsewhere. And I think that is, in a way, what I think it was Carl Bildt yesterday who spoke about the dangers of the Union moving from projecting to protecting. And if we want to be stronger on projecting, then certainly I think success stories and best practice would be a factor in this, but that presupposes credibility and starting the work at home, which there is, and being genuine about this and being genuine about the problems we are facing.
Thank you very much. Political leadership, yes. And then on the big geopolitical matters affecting all this, maybe those who step into the vacuum as well.
This is a difficult conversation because each one of us, my two colleagues, have made brilliant statements, two colleagues, but they don't quite fit together. I think it serves as a reminder that at this point in time we have three agendas on the table. There's a post-wars agenda of traditional great power and emerging power relations. You cannot escape it. You can pretend that it's not there because you want to focus on something else. But the fact of the matter is that that agenda is driven by a set of issues which present no time, no quick fix, no shortcut, no exit. We'll live and we'll die by them, like it or not. Then, beyond that, but related to that post-wars agenda, there's a post-secular agenda. And you can turn the clock back 1,000 years, if you like. Or you can turn it back 35 years. Or you can turn it back just to 9/11 or the spring of 2011. But it's a thing that also must not be and cannot be avoided. It is not, in that context, a time for talking, a time for reflection, It is a time for action. And then there's a third agenda, which is the post-national agenda, where indeed all kinds of issues related to the globalization of the international system emerge. And when indeed, in some cases, we have to give it some thought, build a consent, you choose where your priority is. It's Keynes turned inside out. In the long term, 2030 will be fine, so long as we're not dead by 2020. And if I cannot introduce in there a sense of urgency, then we will not get there. Mm-hmm. That being the case, one, if I may have a couple more minutes, I love Dmitry Trenin. I've known him for half of a lifetime. I happen to think that Russia next to China is not in the position of strength. Since, as we all know, 2005, it has developed a formidable military stature. For the first time in its history, Russia will not need to win a war by providing corpses. It can indeed, as it has shown, not in Georgia, but in Crimea and Syria, it can act quite effectively and expeditiously. But Russia is running out of people, is running out of security space, is running out of resources, and therefore is running out of time. And it's got a 2,400-mile boundary with China, on one side of which you have 500 million Chinese, on the other side of which you have 3 or 4 million Russians. I don't believe that post-Putin Russia will find itself in a cooperative relationship, a G2-like condition, which there is no China card to play by Russia relative to the Europeans or relative to the United States. Russia is not an ascending power, it's a declining power and a decadent state, however dangerous it may be at this time. So I expect Russia eventually to engage the West, and to engage it not in a kind of imperial, dominant, self-domineering fashion as it is used to, but as a demandeur state. Okay? And we're speaking now of 2030, so long as we manage. We were wrong with Russia in the 1990s. We were too strong when they were weak. Then in the year 2000, we got to be too weak when they got strong. We've got to get it right. And in this case, I mean, we, the United States. Okay? And if I may take one more minute to address another. So, you know, Dmitry and I on that score may be looking at it differently, even though I think that Tobias is not here. He will not actually debate that point. One more thing, if I may say. The Americans are not going away from anything. This is just not right. I think Trump is humiliating. I'm an American Casablanca born, and I cannot stand the humiliation he's bringing upon us. He's debasing the idea of the nation, and he's a geopolitical arsonist, eager to call 911 whenever something goes wrong, but he doesn't always know whom to call. So we settle that. But the fact of the matter is that every president since Johnson has been questioned. The Europeans have disliked every president we've had more than his predecessor. It's been a pattern. And I will not take the time, because I don't have it, I'm already abusing of it, to review each one of those three. It's a moment. It will be done by November of 2020 or before. And the Americans have a record. And it is that record which would serve as an opportunity. If the rest of the world cannot understand how well we have done on this half of the world over the past 60 years, it is because, in fact, we ourselves are not proud of it for some reason which mystifies me. If you turn the clock 100 years ago, you have one of the most disastrous military campaigns in Belgium going on. That month alone, the Americans lost 55,000 lives during the battle. Notwithstanding the loss, can you imagine, though, how far we've come back? Balfour had 63 words to set essentially the region in fire after the agreement to allegedly set up boundaries for the... We've done well. If the rest of the world believes that it's better to follow a Chinese model, if any one of you determined that she would rather have a summer house in China than in Europe or in the southwest of the United States, that's fine. That's fine. But I believe we have the reality of what was achieved over the past 70 years. And if we cannot sell this because we question it, because we say, oh, the Europeans really should be talking rather than taking action, should be satisfied with being voyeur about promoting human rights here and there, that is fine too. The United States has not done well over the past 20 years, but it's not all. And the Europeans have done remarkably well over the past 20 years. Single currency, enlargement, and so forth. So I say, hey, if you don't see the opportunity, then you are not paying attention to history. And if you do not see the present risks, then you're not putting your focus where it should be. I'm sorry, I took maybe a couple of minutes.
No, but I think it was...
I'll stop here before I get excited.
Oh, it was... I think it was a very, very suitable and also engaging conclusion to this panel, to really, hear your sense of urgency that I very much share. About valuing what we have, but also not being complacent. I mean, when part of the population doesn't value or doesn't see the absolute interest in what we have built and how it matters for majorities and minorities, like in fact for everyone, then we also have a problem. If we have people who may want to make it more perfect and challenge the core of what we've built in our open societies, while on the other hand, we have sort of more radical forces that are attacking it for other reasons, then we have a problem. So I think there's no time for complacency, but we should also really be proud at times for what we've built and hopefully see the opportunities of what we can still project outward if we decide to do so. Because I think one key element in most of what you said is the importance of political leadership, the importance of paving that way forward, sketching the global perspective, looking at the value of working together, and challenging when credibility is at stake. So I would like to ask you to join me in thanking the panel, and I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you.